And why do people not recognize this immediate event of spermic fusion as being the point at which a new entity comes into existence? Um, I think there are a number of reasons why people are confused. Either they're confused about the nature of a living organism, so they confuse the difference between a cell and an embryo, or they're ignorant about the events that occur early on in development, or they are motivated by politics. They want an answer that puts off or nullifies the difficult questions that are raised by topics such as abortion or human embryonic stem cell research.
Hi, welcome to the Catholic Scientist Podcast, a production of the Society of Catholic Scientists. I am your host, Dr. Dan Keebler, and joining me today, my guest is Dr. Maureen Condic, who is the Vice Provost for Ethics at Catholic University. She's been there since 2024. She spent most of her career at the School of Medicine at the University of Utah, and she was in the Department of Neurobiology there and taught a lot of courses on the curriculum in the med school for human embryology. We both graduated from, got our PhDs at University of California, Berkeley, although at different times. And then she has also written two books recently that we're going to talk about today. She co-authored this book, Human Embryos, Human Beings, that came out in 2018. And then another book called Untangling Twinning, which came out in 2020. So, Maureen, welcome to the program.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here.
All right. We got a lot of interesting things I think we can talk about today. The nature of what is a human embryo? Is it a human being? How do we know? What are the properties of it that give us knowledge of that? When does human life begin? And how can we know when that is, or can we know that? What happens with twinning, or what does that tell us about the origins of human life and what it means to be a person? And then also, I think we'll wrap up by talking about some of the new sort of biotechnology issues regarding creating human embryos and using human embryos for research purposes. So, but before we jump into that, Maureen, it would be great just to hear a little bit about your journey into science. So you did you always have the drive to go into science, thinking, hey, I want to do research and from a young age, or is it something you discerned while you were in an undergraduate, for example?
Well, I was not inclined to be a scientist as a child. My father was a philosopher. My mother was a saint. But beyond that, there was no particular scientific orientation in my family. But I was very bored in school. And so I spent a lot of time in the public library of my small town and discovered the biography section and had already burned through all the young adult things. So I started reading biographies, and being kind of the OCD person I am, I started with A and worked through the alphabet, a book at a time, until I got to C and read a biography of Dr. Curie, Maria Curie. And I just remember closing that book at age 12 with a complete epiphany realization that this is it. I am going to be a scientist. I had never encountered anybody who thought the way I did and who had the kind of passions for understanding the world that I did. And so I was committed. I was going to win the Nobel Prize in chemistry and physics and die at an early age of radium poisoning. Because that was just clearly the route
to go. Yeah.
So it didn't quite work out that way. I didn't end up in physics. I ended up in biology. And I was attracted to biology because cells are sort of the smallest living unit. And yet you can get very precise answers about cells. So there's always a trade-off between the bigness of the question and the precision of the answer. So everybody has to work out where they feel the most comfortable. And I felt comfortable with cells because they were behaving entities. They had complex integration of information, and it was a great place to get a precise answer on a small scale.
Yeah.
So That's how I ended up in cell biology, and in in a late undergraduate and a period in between when I was working as a technician, I became really interested in the brain. How does the brain work, and how does it develop? And development was sort of the biggest problem with the brain. I mean, the brain is a computational machine, but theoretically, we can figure out and actually have made some good progress in figuring out how the brain works. But how the brain develops was then 40 years ago and still is a gigantic mystery. So I picked a tough question that could last for a long time, and I'm
That's a smart career move. There's always questions there to answer that.
yes.
And so you ended up teaching at a school of medicine and doing research there. So what was the focus of your research lab during that time, and sort of what did you?
Yeah, so I continued to be interested in the development of the nervous system, and I ended up working for a long time on sensory development. So how do the components of the nervous system that are involved in detecting information from the outside world, how do they work? How do they develop? How do we set up that system? And a component of my work uh, became sort of questions of regeneration. So it's a curious business in the nervous system that as an embryo, even mammals, even humans, though we've never directly tested humans, are capable of very significant repairs to the nervous system. So if in a mouse, if you transect the spinal cord completely, something that would leave an adult mouse or an adult human paralyzed for life, um, if you do that up through a little bit past halfway through embryonic development or fetal development, the nervous system recovers just fine. So, why is it that those exact same cells, we're not making new cells over our lifetime? How is it that they're able to regenerate and mature cells cannot? So, that pushed me into the field of spinal cord regeneration. I did a lot of work in that area, as well as basic work in how the sensory nervous system is put together during embryonic and fetal life.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's a lot of things that during embryonic development that the cells and the embryo has the capability of doing that we lose as we age, which is sort of fascinating. I think we'll get into that here. But let's start with the book, the first one, the Human Embryos, Human Beings, that you wrote, that came out, you co-authored. It came out in 2018. So what was the goal of that book? Why did you write that book, and what got you interested in getting into these bioethical and philosophical issues as well? Taking a scientific question about, this is the structure of a human embryo, this is its properties, and then what does that mean, theologically and philosophically, particularly.
Yeah, so this book was a collaboration between myself and my brother, who is a professional philosopher. At the time, he was working on some academic work that involved this question, the question of what is a human embryo from a philosophical perspective. But diving into that literature, there are lots of technical questions about embryology that his training did not give him an answer to.
Okay.
So, I quickly went onto his speed dial, and he called me many, many times about, how does embryology work and what's really going on when people say, this, that, or the other is happening in the embryo. So it pretty quickly became clear that he and I had overlapping, but not completely overlapping domains of expertise that really worked quite well together on this topic. So we decided we were going to write a book. And I have to say, as much as I love my brother dearly, um, developing a common language between us was much, much more complicated than I thought it would be. It almost killed our relationship. It took 5 years just to hammer out terminology and, figure out how could we have the same understandings of processes that, we both believed we were talking about the same real world, but but we didn't have the language to do it. So we kind of created this Rosetta Stone that would allow philosophical language to translate into biological
Yeah.
language,
Yeah.
and we learned a lot more than we thought we needed to about each other's topics. So the book came about, and I honestly think it's a phenomenal book. I've read a lot of books in this general space, philosophers talking about biology or biologists talking about philosophy, and usually they're mind-numbingly naive. I mean, you from either expertise, the language is just missing, and the concepts are quite unsophisticated. But this is really, all of that hard work really paid off, I think, in a book that approaches a very complicated topic in a sophisticated manner from both a philosophical and a biological perspective.
Yeah, it's a rare book in that perspective, and the language thing is huge because I've seen that in my work. When you talk to philosophers, they use terms differently than biologists, and then you end up in a totally losing precision. So that's the thing about this book; it very very precise and it defines things, and so you can see that you're on the same page when you're talking about things. So and you address a lot of arguments that people make that say that the human embryo is not a human being, like that it can't be. So maybe you could just sort of take us through a couple of the major ones that you're sort of addressing, and why these are so important. I know particularly one, and I'll just is this idea that, well, we define human beings as things that have these particular properties, but embryo doesn't have those yet. It's developing them, so it can't be a human being yet, right? Until it gets those properties. So I don't know, that's one. If you could sort of just talk about that and how you address that and other ones in the book.
Yeah, so it's a tough question. The book is 300 pages, and if I could summarize the argument, I would have written a much shorter book. but but I think the general approach we took was to start with the most foundational kinds of arguments, the arguments that are the basis for all of the other arguments. And if that argument is correct, all the other arguments we don't even have to address because we've already solved the question. So the most basic philosophical argument is that you can't be a human. An embryo cannot be a human because it contradicts the definition of human. So something that's becoming a human can't be the human before it becomes the human. And this is pretty much exactly what you just mentioned. It's a very common argument out in the public domain as well, that humans are defined by particular traits. And if an embryo or a fetus lacks those traits, then it simply is on its way to becoming a human. It's not a human yet. So we try to address this argument by illustrating both in philosophical and in biological terms that there is no contradiction here. That there's nothing about the fact that you are developing traits that precludes you from being a human. So I'll just give you a simple example. Most of us are familiar with toddlers, and most of us are familiar with the definition of humans, that we are, quote, rational animals. So that's a longstanding traditional definition of what a human is. One could argue with it, but let's accept it for now. And yet, clearly, a toddler, if you've had any experience with them, is not a rational animal. I mean, they're animals
Animals.
sometimes, but they are not rational animals. So the fact that they are not rational animals, that they're not rational, does not ever cause anyone to say, well, toddlers are human then. They're simply becoming human. So why is that? With that intuitive understanding, we know that a toddler is going to become rational, assuming nothing impedes their ability to mature. And they're going to become rational as a consequence of their own intrinsic developmental capabilities. So they are going to develop the capacity for rationality as time goes on. And their ability to bring themselves to that state is completely consistent with them simply being a maturing individual of the kind that will ultimately exhibit rationality. And that same kind of argument applies to a fetus or to an embryo. So it's a very dense argument. We spend a lot of time on it, but I think it's the foundation for all the other arguments that we make.
Yeah, it does seem that if you're going to make the argument that oh, embryos aren't rational, then you have to expand that to a lot of places that you probably wouldn't want to expand that to in terms of humans. So, and it seems that at every stage of human life, there are certain properties and things that it has that it might not have at another stage. So, what is the thing that keeps it the continuity there for being a human? If given that, hey, we behave differently, we act differently as an embryo, as a fetus, as an adult, as a toddler, as you point out, like what is it, the philosophical principle there that makes it a human throughout all of those different stages? Where does that unity
Well, for
come from?
5-year period that my brother and I were trying to develop terminology, this was probably for 3/4 of those years. So,
Okay.
so really work out, mostly because of my ignorance, but also because of my insistence that it had to work with what we know about how embryos actually develop and what they really do scientifically. So we had to develop an understanding, a common understanding of the Aristotelian and Thomistic concept of hylomorphism. So it's a complicated concept, but I think we spend the first chapter of the book really discussing it in terms that I think most people of goodwill should be able to grasp. So I think if you don't start out with a prejudice against looking at these concepts, these philosophical concepts, chapter one is a good read to bring you up to speed on hylomorphism. So this theory or concept originated to explain exactly what it is you're asking about, Dan. The fact that something can change and yet remain the same thing. So we know that entities of all types are defined by traits, by things that characteristics that they have, and that's how we know what they are and can class them into groups. So trees have leaves and bark, and they grow, and they have certain kinds of forms. So those characteristics of the entity, uh, nonetheless, can change over time. We can lose leaves. We can start out as a little tree sapling and grow to a great big oak tree. Um, and how is it that we can confidently know that a little sapling oak tree is the same tree once it's a mature oak, or a little toddler is the same person once they can exhibit rationality and language and everything else? So homomorphism is a theory or a concept, a set of concepts that allows that explains the ability of something to remain the same and yet to change over time. And it involves a lot of sort of technical language that I don't think is helpful at this point.
Yeah.
But there is a way of understanding this, and I think it's absolutely an essential way that all of science rests on the fact that we're studying a single thing. We're studying an entity, and yet many scientists exhibit and study or induce or observe changes in their experimental subject. And at no point does that make us throw the experiment out. We believe we're still looking at the same thing, despite the fact that its properties might have changed. So, so that is the answer to how things can change and still stay the same.
Yeah.
But it's not a simple answer to explain without 5 years of fighting.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it points to that it goes a little bit beyond just sort of a scientific understanding. The fact that material things can't, the material nature of the thing changes over time, but it's still the same thing. And so there's got to be
Right.
something else there. And it gets to some another point you talk about in the book. It's this idea that people argue, well, like every human beings and individuals affected by the environment. It's a little bit different. So what there is no good definition of humans that it's just sort of arbitrary what we decide a human is, or what. So what is your response to that, and how did you address that in the book? The idea that we just
Yeah.
more of a nominalist approach, like we'll just randomly classify these things as human because that's the way we feel today.
Yeah, that is a surprisingly common approach, both among non-philosophers and among philosophers. Philosophically, this sort of an argument falls under the general terminology of developmental systems theory, that developing individuals are so impacted by their environment, and developing individuals would include not just embryos and fetuses, but toddlers and adults and aging adults. Um, so much of how we end up and who we are is impacted by our environment that we really have to kind of consider the entire process of development as a system. And as a consequence, there are no sharp boundaries between an individual human and their environment. And so human is just an arbitrary term. It's something that we created for convenience, but we can call anything we want a human if everybody agrees that that's going to be the case.
Yeah, and that leads to right the trying to define a human as being something that just becomes almost a struggle for whoever has the loudest voice. Then it seems like it's like you lose sort of any sort of objective criteria or sort of
Right.
rational explanation for it. So,
I
oh, go ahead.
Oh, just I think we address this, simply on the basis of its absurdity. I mean, I'm a scientist, and so I believe that I am studying an actual object, and, it's impossible for us to study embryos or subatomic particles or anything else if any entity can be considered that thing.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we have to actually believe that there is a durable nature to something in order to study it. Otherwise, I could pick up my coffee cup and say, "Well, this is an embryo."
Yeah.
And and it's just an embryo that lacks, certain kinds of components and that is defective in terms of the fact that it doesn't have any cells and it has a different, an atypical shape for an embryo. But then, how do we ever study embryos if there is no definition other than me asserting that my coffee cup is an embryo?
Yeah. So how would you assert, I mean, at the end of the book, you talk about, what makes an embryo a human being and what it is about, what are the properties of an embryo that sort of define it? What are the essential characteristics that you use to say, well, this thing's a human embryo? Like, well, how would you
Yeah.
sort of define it if, there's some objective criteria that's going to be needed to know this is a real entity and that coffee cup is not a human embryo?
Yeah. So we start out with the most basic fundamental arguments of, being an embryo being a human defies the definition of human. We work up through arguments that say, all right, well, it could theoretically be a human. It's not contradictory, but the facts don't support it. So we dismiss those arguments based on a realistic understanding of the facts. Um, we address the logical issue we've just discussed with nominalism or developmental systems theory that defines anything according to our personal predilections. And then we finally get to our own definition, based on some work my brother and I had done earlier, defining organisms or living entities as by the fact that they're organized, by the fact that they are not merely a collection of chemicals that just so happens to have those properties, but that the chemicals themselves have different properties in a living being than they do in nature. So, we are large percent carbon in our bodies, and yet naturally carbon forms graphite spontaneously, all by itself, due to the properties of carbon. And yet we never see graphite in humans or in any other living thing, and we never see the kinds of carbon-containing molecules that exist in living things in nature. So it isn't simply that carbon makes for these things, but the carbon is ordered in a particular way, as all the molecules in our body are ordered to be uh, of a certain kind, of a certain type. And so the nature of that organization is that is the nature of what philosophically and theologically people would call a soul. So starting with Aristotle, Aristotle asserted that all living things have souls, and that has been supported by the Catholic Church, for example, that all living things from bacteria on up have souls. And the soul is that set of principles that allows for the ordered relationship among the parts to arise. So um, we define an embryo as a human based on the fact that it has human activities directed by a human soul that can be observed in the earliest stages of development.
Yeah, and those activities are appropriate for this stage of development. So there's not a set of activities that you got to check off that are going to be found at every stage of human. Is that would that be? But there's certain activities that are appropriate for certain stages of existence. But there's at every stage there's this unity and organizational unity, and there's also like some a teleology. It's moving towards something. There's
Y-
a goal oriented behavior, not only to survive but to develop. Right.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, you're completely correct. I think the and it's not something unique to embryos and fetuses. I mean,
Yeah.
we see mature individuals in toddlers and adults who have a period of, say, reproductive ability that they lose a period of cognitive ability that I'm rapidly losing as I get older. so, so there are many sets of behaviors that I exhibit only at certain times and are appropriate to those times of the lifespan.
Yeah. Well, one of the most interesting time points is the beginning of life, and so let's talk a little bit about fertilization. And so, how do we know when life begins? A lot of people talk about the process of fertilization, and I know that's something that you don't like. I said, seeing the fertilization as a process. Development might be a process, but not fertilization. Even though people talk about this largely because I think often people don't think it's hard to pinpoint when life begins. So, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think unambiguously fertilization is an event. It is not a process. There is an instant of fertilization where we pass from a state where we have two cells, two living human cells, the gametes, sperm and egg, and we go to a single cell. And that single cell, and this transition takes a very short time, about 250 milliseconds, so a quarter of a second.
Yeah.
And the sperm and the egg first attach to each other, and when they go from two cells to one cell. And that instant kicks off a very complicated molecular cascade that is radically different from anything you ever see in a sperm or in an egg, and that has a direction associated with it. It's not simply cellular activities for the sake of maintaining this new cell as a healthy and uh, surviving entity. It is directed towards maturation. So all of the processes that occur within this very immediate response to the production of this cell are developmental events. They're events that anticipate the future needs and state of the embryo as a whole. So why do people think of this as a process, and why do people not recognize this immediate event of sperm egg fusion as being the point at which a new entity comes into existence? Um, I think there are a number of reasons why people are confused. Either they're confused about the nature of a living organism, so they confuse the difference between a cell and an embryo, or they're ignorant about the events that occur early on in development, or they are motivated by politics. They want an answer that puts off or nullifies the difficult questions that are raised by topics such as abortion or human embryonic stem cell research. So let's take those one at a time. So I think it's important for listeners to understand that all cells in the body are alive, but they are parts of the body. They are living and contribute to the life and function and health and survival of you as a whole person. Uh, they have different properties, skin cells, from heart cells, but they are only have meaning in the context of the entity as a whole.
Yeah. So there's another real interesting property of embryos at that early stage, and that's their ability to undergo monozygotic twinning, right? And you have the book Untangling Twinning, which I think is a very interesting and fascinating topic. Where you could just sort of talk a little bit about the process of twinning, when can it happen, how might it happen, and then we could sort of look at what does that tell us about when's life begin and when the ensoulment and so forth and things like that. So when do you see monozygotic twinning? Well, what do we know about it in terms of when can it occur and up to what point, and how does it work?
Um, we know from observations in the fertility clinic that splitting of an embryo prior to implantation has never people never see an embryo spontaneously dividing into, despite the fact that monozygotic twinning is the incidence of monozygotic twinning is greatly elevated in IVF procedures. So based on that, the most likely conclusion is that twinning probably happens at about 5 to 7 days. Um, at a stage when the embryo is initially covered by a protein coat that protects the embryo as it's traveling down towards the uterus. But in order to implant, it has to escape from this protein coat, this protective coat. And it does it in a process called hatching, where the embryo secretes some enzymes in a particular location, makes a very small hole in the protein coat, and then squeezes out of this little tiny hole. So imagine sort of an inflated soccer ball squeezing out from from a coating around it. During this process, you sort of pinch into a little figure eight kind of shape, and that can result in splitting of that soccer ball into two little soccer balls. And if that happens, that's the most likely point at which monozygotic twinning occurs.
Okay. And so when that happens, does that indicate that uh, the the cells have this potential to form a new life? So would you say that up until that point, people argue, well, there's no individuality because you could become two people, and so maybe that is, it's life begins when the process of twinning might end, right? So it seems like there's always, oh, well, the process of life doesn't begin, or you're not human until you can't become a twin, or until you have maybe brainwaves or whatever. There's always something, but this twinning one is one that I hear. Well, until you can't twin anymore, or become a twin, you're not a stable, unified entity like we're talking about. You have this potential to be two.
Right.
Well, you're not really human until that's over. Now you are who you are, or something.
Right. And I think that is both an emotionally compelling argument, but it's also a strong historical argument. It was started, back in the 1970s by a man by the name of Clifford Gropstein, who introduced this term of pre-embryo, that prior to the point at which you can no longer undergo twinning, which is about 14 days of natural development. You're not really an embryo. You're not an individual. You're simply something that is on its way to becoming an embryo, but isn't there yet. Um, but again, this reflects either a desire to simplify the question and eliminate all the confusions that arise or the complications that arise from abortion and from stem cell research, or in Grobstein's case, from IVF.
Okay.
Um, or it's just a refusal to look at the evidence. So we know that from the very instant of sperm egg fusion, within 1 to 3 seconds following that event, a series of molecular events are initiated that are part of a clearly developmental program of an entity that is clearly an organism. So we know that there is a single organism that's undergoing a natural process of development ordered towards its own health and maturation. And we observe that all the way through up to the point when twinning is likely to occur. So what happens with twinning? I mean, so we cannot say that there isn't an individual there. There is a single individual that's directing its own development in a completely coordinated and complex way for days
Right.
prior to twinning happening. So, um, again, this is sort of an unfamiliarity thing. We're not familiar with the idea that we're transiently a triploid entity, and we're not familiar with the idea that humans are capable of asexual reproduction for the first 14 days of life. So many organisms can be split in two, and will each half will regenerate what's missing and become an independent organism. And that doesn't mean that there isn't a single organism there at the beginning. I mean, the most celebrated case of embryos or animals that are capable of this kind of reproduction is a flatworm known as the planarian. And planarians, it's been shown, can be cut into 256 pieces, and each of those pieces will, and they're tiny. I mean, they're
Yeah.
like so very skilled surgeons here, cutting them into 256 pieces. Um, they there's not. It's not the case that it wasn't a single animal prior to cutting, and it's not the case that there were 256 worms somehow crammed inside of the body of this one animal. It's the case that you can split these animals and they regenerate. Each half will replace the parts that are missing and reconstitute a whole. And this is what happens in human twinning as well. So the first argument that you're not an individual prior to twinning is just absurd because it's contradicted by mountains of evidence that cannot be interpreted in any other way. There's clearly an ordered process of a single individual undergoing development prior to twinning. So I think the second element of why this is compelling to people is this notion of, well, then who's the original embryo? What is the nature of the twin? And that's it. That's a tough philosophical question, right?
Yeah, that's one of those people ask, well, from a Catholic perspective, how do you understand the ensoulment of twins? Is there one
Right.
soul, and then that soul disappears, and now there's two new souls, or is there a continuity there of an organism? Right. So what's your thoughts on that, and how would you look at that?
Well, unfortunately, we don't have a molecular test for the organism or a marker for the soul.
Right.
Okay, we do have observational markers. We can determine a soul by the behaviors of the living thing. So, going back to Aristotle and the Catholic Church's teaching on the soul, we know all living things have souls, but the Catholic Church holds that human souls are unique because they are uniquely created by God. So, and they're immortal. They don't desist or cease to exist when the entity dies. So, if every bacteria has a soul, then souls can arise spontaneously whenever a bacteria divides into to produce two bacteria. Now we have two souls. So souls can be a completely natural consequence of the ordered relationships of the parts of a living thing. And the church would hold that that's true for all living organisms other than humans. So for human soul to come into existence, the matter, the cells that are producing the human have to be well ordered, have to be capable of receiving a soul. But the soul is created by God. So when fertilization happens and sperm egg fusion occurs, God creates a soul. And that is the soul of that developing embryo until the point of splitting. So what happens then?
Right.
Uh, where this is where I just have to say logic takes over, right? Let's just consider one half of the split embryo and observe what happens. So we know from a lot of work, predominantly in model animal systems, for example, in mice, that if you intentionally split an embryo, what it does is it immediately heals itself. So it goes from a ball of cells that's cut in half to a sealed ball of cells very quickly. And it also immediately replaces the cell types that are missing, and it replaces them very accurately. So if it's predominantly missing a particular type of cell, it will predominantly make those cells. So it reestablishes the initial state. And it does this absolutely lockstep in coordination with the unsplit control siblings that are in the same experiment. So there's no pause, there's no delay. It just continues on with development, reestablishes the state it was in initially, and moves forward. So, based on that, there's no evidence for a death
Mm.
and there's no evidence for restarting. So, we're not going back to stage zero and we're
Right.
not the embryo and beginning all over again. The only or the most reasonable interpretation of those observations is that we start with a whole embryo, it gets a grave wound, and it heals itself. It is an injured embryo, and then it's a healed embryo, and it goes forward. And based on that, there's no reason to conclude that the original embryo has gone out of existence. So we have an embryo, it's injured, it repairs itself, it moves forward. Same embryo as was produced by sperm egg fusion. Okay, so one of the embryos, the soul that was produced by God at the beginning persists. So what about the other half? Well, logically, the the conclusions we've just drawn about the first half in no way depend on the status of the second half. So the second half is a separate question. But we've already established that the original embryo persists. It's wounded, it heals itself, it moves forward in development. So what happens in the case of the second half is it behaves exactly the same, which means God has to create a new soul at that point for this new embryo. Which of the two halves is the original? That's a very tough question. I mean, it is theoretically possible to answer that question, but it would involve very unethical experiments, and it shouldn't be done in humans. But one could potentially determine it based on the particular state of the molecular mix that exists in the zygote and how that gets modified over time. But right now, we just can't tell.
Yeah.
And that's not a question of uncertainty because we're certain one of them is the original and one of them is new. It's a question of knowledge, the inability to, given current technology and given moral constraints of the kind of experiments you could do, to determine which of those two twins is the original twin,
Yeah. Well,
the original embryo.
well, you talk about moral constraints in terms of experiments, and so maybe we could switch into this here as we get towards the end of our time to talk about embryo research and these new, traditional embryo models from IVF and so forth, but now there's some of these new embryo models. And just to begin, let's just talk about why, people that aren't familiar with this field, why people would want to do research on human embryos. There's always, these experiments. Oh, we want to modify humans and make, genetically superior human. But putting that aside, why would a researcher want to do research on human embryos and test them? So what's the scientific drive for this?
Well, there are a number of reasons why people want to do experiments on human embryos. First off, we're all just curious about our own origins. I think it's a very compelling question. How does that work? And I think it's natural for people to want to study and understand our own beginnings. So, uh, a second reason people might want to study embryos is there are lots of medical conditions that are due to defects during development, and understanding those defects, how they arise, how they progress, out of compassion. A lot of people want to study those things in order to potentially help individuals who are afflicted by these conditions. So there are at least two understandable and noble reasons why people want to study embryos. Some people want to study embryos for exactly the transhumanist agenda that you've mentioned. They want to improve embryos. They want, and this can span the range of treating a genetic disease, eliminating the likelihood that an individual will suffer during life, all the way up through, making us better, faster, you know, more efficient, smarter, more beautiful, whatever goals the parents might have.
Yeah.
Um, and then there's just, you know, the wow factor. Being able to do something that nobody's ever done before is for a lot of people very compelling. So I think those are the reasons that people might want to study embryos, but not all of them are legitimate.
Yeah, right. So where, how do they, are these are mostly traditionally using embryos that are left over from IVF, or are they creating these embryos to do the early stages of research on them? Where are these embryos coming from? How do they being produced in general for the research field?
Yeah, you're right. Most embryos in research are donated by parents who have excess embryos from fertility treatments. And the main reason for that is it's medically dangerous and painful to obtain eggs,
Hmm.
and you need a woman who volunteers for it. And most women are not willing to do that unless they have the motive of having their own child, or they're getting paid as an egg donor for fertility clinics. Um, so that is the source of the vast majority of embryos that are used for research is donated embryos from IVF. The exception is a fairly recent development of the production of synthetic embryos from human stem cells. So we have some new techniques that are able to take stem cells, which you can grow in infinite quantities, and induce them to assume a state that's very similar to a naturally occurring cell in an early embryo. So we induce cells to assume that a phenotype or a cell type that's very similar to the first three cells of the embryo. And then we put those cells together, and in a rare number of cases, they self organize and undergo early development,
What
all by
stage do
herself.
they come out at? Where do they? We talked about like fertilization, then you talk about the blastocyst stage. Where when you mix these three cell types out, what if they do sort of organize into something that looks like a human embryo? What stage do they come at?
Well, the best work so far has been done in mice, and those uh, embryos will proceed to the stage of early brain formation and early organ formation. So about halfway through natural mouse development is the best that has been achieved so far. Humans obviously develop over a much longer time. Uh, Mice are fully done in 21 days, and humans take 9 months. But for human embryos that have been produced in this manner, they go up through the stage of maybe about 7 to 10 days
Okay.
of development.
And so,
So,
but they skip the
it-
first few days basically because you've mixed
yeah,
these cells together, so they appear as embryos at what stage would they appear when they start?
at about the blastocyst
Oh,
stage. So maybe sort of that ball of cells stage prior to implantation. So yeah, they get pretty far.
and so would you consider these actually human embryos? Because people argue, well, they're just the models of human embryos. They're not really human embryos because they're, you skip the first few days of development and they might not look exactly like a normal human embryo. So what would be, going back to your definition, like what a human embryo is, would this be considered a human embryo or how would you know?
Yeah, well, we have a lot of ways of making humans. We can make humans the old-fashioned way by spermate fusion. We can make humans by monozygotic twinning, which we've just discussed. We can also make humans by cloning, and that's been done. So this is a fourth way of making a human. And I know that because, if it looks like a duck and it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's a duck.
Yeah.
And that is what we see in these models. They are of human constitution. They have human DNA, human proteins, human cells. They do what human embryos do. And given that organization is and development are the two hallmarks of a human embryo, they are doing what human embryos do. Now they're doing it imperfectly. So they are defective embryos or embryos that are deficient in capa- some capabilities, but they are nonetheless undergoing development, and that makes them an embryo.
Yeah. Yeah, and you mentioned how they can't go, or at least as far as you know, past a certain point. But there's been over time a lot of scientific research organizations have this 14-day limit. Say we shouldn't do any research on human embryos after 14 days. Part of that was we couldn't actually keep them developing normally for that long, so it wasn't really a restriction with any sort of consequence. But now it seems like we're getting the technology to maybe do that, to be able to develop humans past that or uh, in the lab longer than 14 days. Do you think what do you see in terms of sort of research limits? Do you think that this is something that's going to disappear and people are going to continue doing research on human embryos, that they might be able through different culture techniques keep alive for 21 days or 28 days and so forth? What do you see
Right.
happening in the field?
I think that first off, there is a lot of pressure to abandon this guideline of 14 days. I do want to note that in the United States, there are no actual binding rules that prevent people from doing experiments for longer than that. The actual size of the growing embryo becomes a limitation in terms of the efficiency of culture because it's very hard to run just to provide oxygen sufficiently, nutrition, and waste removal. So I think there would have to be fairly significant change to get significantly beyond 14 days. I think we could probably get up to the 20s with current technology, but I think beyond that, we're going to need some kind of a um, gas and nutrition exchange that we don't currently have a way of doing. So, um,
Some type of artificial placenta or a placental model?
yep,
Yeah.
or kind of a placental model or implantation model that would allow development to proceed further. But there are ways around that too. I mean, the other sort of scary development in the scientific world is that we've been able to use stem cells for many years, for about 10 years, to produce functional gametes, to produce sperm and egg. But there have been lots of technical challenges with doing that, and many of which made it impossible for them to ever be applied to humans. However, recently, within the last few years, there have been really significant improvements in this approach, and so it is now possible to take human cells and to make functional eggs and functional sperm, regardless of the gender of the donor. So, so this would enable a number of really thought-provoking kinds of procedures. So it would certainly allow same-sex couples to have a baby that was genetically related to both partners. It would also allow solo parenting. So if I just decided I wanted to be a mom all by myself, or you decided you wanted to be a dad, well, you would have to recruit a woman to gestate the
Yeah.
baby. But but beyond that, I could certainly, or I could have in the past when I was younger, have just produced my own sperm and eggs and made a baby all by myself. That was genetically related to me, not a clone, but genetically related to me.
Oh, wow. So this has been done in humans, and have they actually done IVF experiments with this to see if these eggs are and sperm are functional, or is it just based on their properties? They look functional. It's very curious how far they've gone with this.
How far they've gone with it? Well, right, these are nice, and they do work all the way up through live birth in mice.
Okay.
So you can make functional sperm and eggs, and you can make baby mice as a consequence of that. And those baby mice are themselves also fertile, which is sort of the acid test of have you made a normal animal, is that it can mature to adulthood and it can also naturally reproduce. So now you've tested all the systems that are necessary. Humans have some technical challenges compared to mice in terms of the size of the egg and the fragility of them. Uh, but people are doing these experiments currently in humans, and um, I think at least initially there will be opposition to implantation of these
Mhm.
of these embryos. Even the most gung ho science moves forward kind of advocates have uh, have proposed that one of the restrictions for both these synthetic embryos that are made directly from stem cells and for embryos that we produce by synthetic gametes, um, that they not be implanted either into an animal host or into a human host. But I think that will fall over time, in
Yeah.
all likelihood.
It does seem like a lot of these guidelines you see with stem cell research and embryonic stem cell research, these guidelines are put up to allow certain things to happen, and they say, "Oh, we got this guideline," and then we'll go past that and put another one up. And so they're
Yep.
not absolute moral guidelines. They're just so, well, right now we don't really know what the effect of this would be. So you see this with like the genetic modification of human embryos. Well, at this point, we shouldn't do this and implant these then into
Right.
human embryos. But it's not as if there is no way this should happen. This is unethical. It's more like at this point we don't know enough to do that. And so it seems all these guidelines are sort of fuzzy and made to
Well,
be
see,
not fuzzy, but made temporary, made to be taken down when needed.
they're they're made to be strategic.
Yeah.
So when the possibility first arises is when you have the strongest opposition to it.
Mhm.
And if we can say, all right, we're not going to allow it to go in this bad direction that everybody foresees. We're just going to do the basic science, and there will be guide rails, and there will be endpoints and things that we're not going to do. And people say, oh, all right, I guess we can accept that. And then when the technology advances to the point where we want to go past those guide rails, um, people say, well, we've been doing this for years. What are you all alarmed about? This is not a new technology. Society has already accepted the notion that we're going to make synthetic gametes and produce babies from them. All we're asking now is to give those babies a chance to live by planting them.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's so true. You see this again and again. So, um, Well, you mentioned like why people, when I asked you about why people are going to do research with human embryos, some of it is just to understand normal human development, but also to maybe understand human diseases and developmental disorders and so forth, so that maybe you can have therapies in the future. So, are there what ethical alternatives are there for doing this? Do these exist in your mind that would get you to this very similar, if not the same, answers that you might get by doing human embryo research?
Yeah, I have strongly argued that there are alternatives. I mean, there's a very, very strong conservation between animals and humans in terms of the basic mechanisms of development, the molecules and the cells that are involved, the processes that occur. That doesn't mean they're identical. It means that they are very similar. And the things we learn from animal models have very consistently applied to humans directly. This is the basis of most drug development, most medical procedures that are developed. We start with animals, they work in animals, we try them on a limited number of human volunteers, and, you know, generally speaking, they work. So, animal research is also easier, faster, less expensive, and more scientifically powerful than research on humans. I mean, it just simply is. We can get animals in limited numbers. We can, well,
Yeah.
limit hands, but yes. We have a much broader range of control over animal models than we do over human models. And so long as we stay within reasonable guidelines for treatment of animals in a humane and compassionate way, um, there's no limit on what can be done. So this is why the great majority of biomedical and pharmaceutical and biological research is done using animal models. And I don't see any way that should change. I think there may be things that we could learn by doing unethical, cruel experimentation on humans. And just as has always been the case, I think we need to be willing to say there are some things that we simply can't know. There will be kinds of knowledge that we can't obtain because we need to uphold the dignity of human persons. And we've seen this, and we don't have to go in too far into the past to see. Most people are familiar with the Nuremberg trials of the Nazi doctors who did horrible things to
Mhm.
humans, and they gained very valuable
Right.
information that can't be gained any other way. And in fact, that information in many cases is still part of medical textbooks today, um, because that's the only way we were able to learn it. But I think most people would say that we simply should have accepted a limitation in our knowledge.
Yeah. No, that's a great point because I think people always say, well, you're limiting scientific knowledge, but we all do that regardless of our ethical, moral, theological background. We're all going to draw a line somewhere. And, even a committed atheist would probably draw a line that I don't want to, do experiments on young children without their knowledge or whatever that could damage. So we do draw ethical lines. So it's not as if this is any different than what researchers have been doing for years to argue that we shouldn't be doing this type of research. There's an ethical,
Eh,
moral line there. So, um,
I think embryos, what that argument always starts with is, well, they're not really humans anyway.
right, yeah,
And so, there should be no limitations on what we can do with an embryo because it's not really a human. And that's why having a more integrated view of a view that actually reflects the nature of that developing individual is so important because you're right. Most people would say, "Oh no, we should never do experiments like the Tuskegee syphilis experiments or the Willowbrook experiments, where m- developmentally disabled children were infected intentionally with viruses to see what would happen." And um, we shouldn't do those things. But that's only because they're humans.
yeah, yeah. And I think that's why your book, Human Embryos, Human Beings, is so important, so useful, because it does address that fundamental. That's the question that gets the ball rolling for people to say that these aren't actually human beings, and then we can do what we want. And if you don't address that argument, then it's hard to make progress anywhere else. So,
I
yeah.
And, I'm not trying to trivialize the complexity of these questions. I mean, they are very tough questions. The scientists who have done immoral and unethical experiments on humans in the past were genuinely motivated by trying to learn something and to contribute to better health, better welfare outcomes for individuals. Not the individuals they were experimenting on necessarily, but for society in some broad sense. so so there's true malice. Somebody who just wants to torture and destroy simply because that's what they want to do is an extraordinarily rare thing. So we have to we have to be clear sighted in this, and we have to be able to balance the ethical concerns, and we have to be willing to walk away from things that there's no good way of ever learning.
Yeah. Well, it's great, Maureen. Thank you. This has been a fascinating discussion. A lot of interesting things that I've learned and that have came up here in our conversation. So thanks for taking the time to sit down and talk about human embryos when life begins and twinning and embryo research and so forth. So I appreciate your time, Maureen.
All right, I appreciate it. I had a fun time too. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Catholic Scientist podcast, sponsored by the Society of Catholic Scientists. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing. And you can also show your support by donating to the Society to help us produce content like you just heard. You can donate by going to our website at catholicscientist.org and clicking on the donate button. You can also find other useful resources, articles, and videos on our website.